This story is about my sisters, Juniper and Marigold, June and Mary, twins born on the first day of September, 2.5 years older than me. We lived in rural Wisconsin. Our father was a long-haul trucker and our mother waited tables at the Denny's. Mary, June and I were great explorers, charting the woods behind our modest home with construction paper and dulled crayons. We spent most of our time playing outside, sun, rain, or snow. There was safety in numbers. We were always back in time for dinner. In retrospect, I'm not even certain our mother knew just how far from home we strayed. This is a story about a lake we found, a couple of miles into the wilderness. It was a Saturday in early February. We were bundled up in puffy jackets and snow pants. When we first came across the clearing, it was striking. The most beautiful thing my young eyes had ever seen. Crisp white snow, sprawling flat as far as the eye could see. There wasn't so much as a twig or paw print to interrupt the pristine blanket of powder. It was Mary who realized there was water beneath. She pointed out the reed stalks that speckled the perimeter, even approached what must have been the edge, crouched down, and brushed away the snow to reveal ice. She was always very science-minded, even with her mere 12 years of experience on the planet. She was one of the smartest people I knew. So of course, she was the first to ask why we'd never seen this lake before. In all of our years of wandering, we must have come this way at least a dozen times. I had no answers. I simply shrugged and pulled my hat down tighter around my ears to stave off the cold. June was silent, staring out into the vast expanse of white. Other people had trouble telling my sisters apart, but I never did. They had the same wavy chestnut hair, gray eyes, and angular jaws. They had the bones of birds, thin and fragile. But June was softer, quieter. She had more freckles sprinkled across her cheeks. Mary questioned, and June listened. And that was the way it had always been. "Do you hear that?" she almost whispered, gaze glued to the horizon. "What?" I asked, somehow feeling I should just be quiet. "The crying. Someone is crying." "Junie, what are you talking about?" Mary straightened up, dusting the snow off of her gloves. June raised a finger to her lips, requesting silence. I didn't hear anything. No birds, no rustling trees. I'm not sure I ever experienced a deeper or more unsettling quiet. There's one skill Mary never quite developed. It was keeping her mouth shut. It only added to the gravity of the situation when her eyes widened in sudden comprehension and a full minute passed before she said anything. "Where's that coming from?" She wheeled around, staring at the frozen lake, just like June was. June took a few steps closer to the edge of the lake. There was an odd look in her eye, one I've never seen before or since. She looked empty, like an upright shell with nothing inside it. Her face was devoid of any expression. Mary, on the other hand, was growing more agitated by the moment. "We have to look for help," she blubbered. "There was a hunting cabin a little ways back, wasn't there? The Darby boys have a hut out here. We'll go find them." June didn't give any indication of agreement or dissent. Mary grabbed my shoulder and squeezed it. "Ryan, you and June stay put. Stay right here and I'll be back." I nodded, confused more than a little afraid. I still didn't hear anything. I accepted it all, because the prospect of both my sisters going insane at the same time seemed less plausible than my just not being able to pick up on what they were hearing. Mary bounded off, leaving boot prints in the snow. I watched her run until she disappeared between the trees. When I turned around, June was already a few feet out into the lake. I called to her, asking what she was doing. No response. I yelled that it could be dangerous and that she should turn around. She ignored me. I started crying. At first, they were crocodile tears, the kind a little brother can usually muster when he's trying to get pity or attention from his older sisters. But it turned all too real when the resounding crack echoed through the air. June sunk below the ice instantly. My cowardice is probably the thing that saved me. I was paralyzed, shocked, and terrified. There was a gaping hole where my sister had been. No matter how much I wanted to move, to run to her, to save her, I couldn't do it. I just stood there as the seconds ticked by into minutes, and she was surely dead. Time. It's a funny thing to pin down. I couldn't honestly tell you how long it was before Mary showed up, with 2 of the Darby boys in tow, and I tearfully choked out what happened. The Darby boys looked at me in utter bewilderment. Mary frowned with concern. June is right over there. Mary pointed. I turned to look. There was no hole in the ice. June was standing a ways off, next to the edge of the pond, still staring at some unidentified point in the distance. Apparently, whatever sound Mary heard had stopped. The Darby boys rolled their eyes and grumbled about what wild imaginations my sisters had, but they walked us back towards a more clearly marked trail and said we shouldn't wander off too far. June didn't say a word the whole walk home. The hairs on the back of my neck kept prickling, like someone was staring at me. But any time I glanced over, June was looking straight ahead. Maybe I imagined it, but I could have sworn there were droplets of water clinging to her eyelashes. This is a story about how my sisters started to change. I was still a little young to understand the finer points of puberty, but June's came early. We were sitting on the couch together when she bled through her soft pink sweatpants. She didn't stand up right away. In fact, she probably noticed long before I did. Guess I'm a woman now. Fucking fantastic. She started shaving her legs and wearing tighter clothes. She'd put on makeup in the girls' bathroom at school. She used to have lunch with Mary and I, but with the change in appearance, people started to notice her. It wasn't long before she sat at the same table as the girls who had money, the girls who lived in bigger houses and carried around real leather purses and drank pilfered strawberry vodka when they had sleepovers. It wasn't long before June started talking to boys and twirling locks of hair around her index finger as she giggled at jokes that weren't funny. June used to come into my room late at night and sit at the edge of the bed. Sometimes she'd talk to me, sometimes she would just stare. Either way, it seemed threatening in a manner that was hard to place. I would pretend to be asleep if it was late enough, but we both knew I wasn't. Sometimes I would cry. "You watched me die, Ryan," she would say in that soft, eerie, calm voice. "You didn't even try to save me." "I'm sorry." Pressing my face into the pillow didn't hide the tears, but I didn't know what else to do. "You don't love me." "I do, June. I'm sorry. I was scared." "You have no idea what it's like to drown. All that stuff about it being peaceful is bullshit. It hurts, Ryan. It feels like barbed wire wrapping around your lungs. It's like being trapped in a tiny box that keeps getting smaller and smaller until you're completely crushed." She would lean down to whisper right in my ear, her hand on the back of my neck, squeezing just a little too hard, was icy as the first snow. During the day, she'd carry around those little chemical hand warmers that skiers put in their gloves, but she wanted me to feel the cold. Because it was my fault. Say you love me, Ryan. I love you, June. Good boy. Frank Darby went missing. I was probably the last person to see him alive, or, well, second to last. I saw him climbing out of June's bedroom window a little after sunset while I was raking leaves. It wasn't a secret what they'd been doing. I'd gone outside because I could hear the slick sounds and creaking mattress springs through the thin walls. June climbed out after him, smiling much too wide. Her hair was messy and her face was flushed. The two of them got into the branches of a tall maple tree that grew beside our house and shimmied down it. They walked towards the woods, holding hands. Just as they were about to disappear into the trees, June looked over her shoulder and winked at me. The park rangers found Frank about a week later. I didn't see the body, only heard stories. It's hard to say what was embellished and warped in the game of telephone that spread throughout town, but the most common details are that Frank's throat was ripped out and his ribs had been cracked open. Whatever killed him took his heart. My mother fell ill, stage 3 breast cancer. I was 12. June and Mary had recently turned 15. Mary cried a lot. June spent most of her time at the hospital, stroking Mom's hair and feeding her soup. Sometimes I wonder if her hands were cold. I wonder what my mother thought about that in the fading twilight. Mom died in the middle of the night in early spring. June was the only one in the room with her. Joe Darby met a similar fate to his older brother, for a slightly different reason. Joe asked Mary to the homecoming dance. At that point, Mary was wearing glasses. We didn't have much money, so her dress was from the thrift store, several decades out of fashion. She and Joe swayed back and forth at arm's length, smiling awkwardly. Or, that's how I imagine it happened. I wasn't there. I was there for the shouting match in our backyard, when June called Mary a cunt, and they pulled each other's hair and fingernails broke skin as they tumbled on the ground together. Joe went missing shortly after that. Mary spent a lot of time searching the woods for him. After June apologized, they went together. They disappeared into the trees, holding hands, and a pile of bricks settled at the pit of my stomach. Mary came back with damp hair and stopped wearing her glasses. A few days later, the police found the shredded remains of Joe Darby, once again, missing his heart. And this is a story about a lake in the middle of the woods, and how my sisters tried to drown me in it. It was a foggy winter morning. My sisters kept throwing each other meaningful looks across the breakfast table, communicating in that way twins will, having a conversation I could never hope to understand. I was 14 and afraid of both of them. When they asked me if I wanted to go on a hike, I said no. They didn't insist. They didn't have to. Mary made breakfast. The sleeping pills were already in my system. When the drowsiness hit, I tried to make myself throw up, but it was too late. They put me on a sled and dragged me out into the forest. I was unconscious for most of it, just little flashes of trees and sky. They waited for me to wake up. They were standing over me, completely naked, smiling wider than a human mouth should be able to stretch. They didn't seem uncomfortable, despite the frigid wind whipping through their hair and the snow between their bare toes. "Can you hear it yet, Ryan?" June laughed. "I'm sure you will. You'll join them, all of them, at the bottom of the lake, screaming for help, begging for mercy. It's a little pathetic, really." I wanted to believe I was dreaming, but I knew I wasn't. In a dream, my sisters would have shifted into something monstrous. Their hands would have become talons. Their teeth would have morphed into fangs around a forked tongue. But they looked the same as they ever had, identical except for the freckles. They each grabbed one of my arms and lifted me to my feet with a surprising strength. They stepped in tandem, slowly towards the edge of the lake in a grim procession. I was the star of it all. My survival instincts must have kicked in about halfway to the ice. I began to struggle and scream, sure that nobody was listening. What is there to do when faced with imminent death but shriek at the heavens for mercy? As I screamed, there was a swelling chorus of tortured cries. It sounded as if the ground had opened up beneath me to unleash the anguish of the damned. The deafening noise echoed all around us, centering on the lake that was no longer frozen over, but frothing and steaming like the surface of a cauldron. My sisters held my shoulders firmly and lowered me into the water, feet first. It was blistering, painful beyond the point where I could distinguish heat or cold. It burned. That was all I knew. Perhaps it's poetic that a Darby saved me. Perhaps it was divine intervention. I tend to think it was nothing but dumb luck. It's hard for me to believe in God anymore. Or at least, I can't believe in a God that is fair and merciful. The only thing I know for sure is that evil exists. Something dark and twisted claimed both of my sisters and will never give them back. But a gunshot rang through the air just when the water was lapping at my knees. June released her grip on me suddenly. My center of gravity shifted backwards. It was enough time for me to wrench out of Mary's grasp and crawl back up on the snowy bank of the lake. I couldn't stand, but I kept pulling myself along, farther and farther away from the water. 2 more shots in rapid succession cracked through the air above me. I saw the 80-year-old grandmother Helen Darby with a floral handkerchief tied around her head, holding a double-barrel shotgun, aiming it at the lake. I didn't turn around until long after she rushed past me. June's naked body lay prone on the lake shore, bullet wound in her back leaking blood into the ground, steam floating into the air from her torn flesh. Mary was nowhere to be seen. I didn't hear any more gunshots. Helen Darby circled around after a while. She put me back on the sled and dragged me to the hunting hut, where the rangers came to get me. I lost 3 of my toes to frostbite. I consider myself lucky. After my sisters disappeared, Helen Darby effectively adopted me. Whenever my father wasn't home, she'd make it a point to stop by. She'd teach me how to cook, help me figure out how to run the washing machine, knit while I did my homework or watch TV. Most importantly, she'd sit in the living room with a shotgun, long into the night, making sure whatever had gotten a taste of me didn't come back for another bite. When I was old enough, or rather on my 15th birthday, Helen gave me a gun of my own and taught me how to use it. Part of me knew it was all a little bizarre, but I could pretend it was about the grandsons she'd lost. She was just treating me as their replacement. We only talked about what happened at the lake once and never again after that. It was a cold night in December. We were sitting by the fireplace, listening to a radio broadcast of A Christmas Carol. Helen had been drinking gin straight from the bottle for a couple of hours. She often got sad when she drank. Her baggy, wrinkled eyes shone with a hint of tears, and the corners of her mouth sagged downwards. "There's something out in the woods," she said suddenly, unspoken context looming over us. "It takes the little girls, and it kills the men. It's been there longer than this town. Folks just stopped believing in it." I had so many questions, but couldn't voice any of them. I just stared at her wide eyes. "It still talks to me, always talks to me. It tried to make me kill my brother, my husband, my sons. But I'm too old for it now. Can't do much besides talk. I've tried avoiding it, but look at what it did. Now, somebody has to stay out there." She took another long swig from her bottle. "You know, I'm not going to live forever, Ryan." I nodded, solemn. Life already a tangled mess of grief. What better cause could I pursue than wardenship? "You know what has to be done when I'm gone." It wasn't a question, it was a statement, a sigh of relief. This is a story about how I moved into a small cabin in the middle of the woods. I hunt and fish and sell lumber to whoever needs it. I don't hear the voices or the screams, but some moonlit nights there's a rapping on my window. I see the silhouette of a shriveled, naked woman with matted chestnut hair. One day, she will probably finish what she started. Until then, I will keep watch and do my best to pass along the story. The worst things happen when we try to forget the warnings of a different time. Don't wander into the woods. Don't stray off the path. Something evil might get you, just like it got to me.